Hey, what is up, everybody? Welcome to the Guilty as Charged podcast, presented by the Chargers Podcast Network. As always, my name is Steven, and I am the host, and joining me today is my guy, Tyler. Tyler, what's up, man? How you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing fantastic. We have a great interview for you guys in just a bit. And Chargers fans, how are you? We are, as of recording this, 2 weeks from camp. How you doing? We're almost there.
Yeah, countdown to camp has officially begun, and it's getting closer and closer. Really excited about the interview that we have today, as Tyler mentioned. Mr. Ted Nguyen of The Athletic is going to be joining us, talking all things related to Kellen Moore, Brandon Staley. We asked him about J.C. Jackson, and we just had a great conversation, and we'll get to that here in a second. But yeah, it was very insightful. Can't thank him enough for joining us, and hopefully you guys enjoy it. After the interview, Tyler and I are going to sit down and talk about the undrafted free agents that the Chargers have, and potentially some guys that could really push for roster spots. Obviously, the Chargers have a great tradition in that regard. Obviously, recent guys like Austin Ekeler and Michael Davis, for example. So certainly possible that the Chargers do have a gem in this undrafted free agent class, and we'll sit down and talk about all of those guys. Before we get started, before we get to that interview, as always, Tyler and I are fans of the team just like you guys are. We are independent content creators, and as such, the opinions that we share on this episode and every episode are not always reflected of the Chargers organization. These are our opinions, and they're ours alone. So that's that. All right, let's get to this interview with Mr. Ted Nguyen. Hope you guys enjoy it, and we'll see you on the other side. All right, guys, as I said earlier, super excited to be joined by Ted Nguyen of The Athletic, who does a great job covering the NFL. I know at least formerly covering the Raiders, but I know specifically, doing some X's and O's stuff for The Athletic on Twitter. One of the best guys to follow. I participated in a Spaces with him recently with Coach Voss. It was very enlightening, and I had a ton of fun doing that. So, Ted, thanks so much for joining us today, man. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Happy to have you here. Thanks for taking the time today. We have a lot of great stuff to get into, so we'll just dive in. Obviously, the Chargers making the big move from Joe Lombardi to Kellen Moore, and a lot of people kind of the hype is really starting to build recently with Kellen Moore kind of taking over the offense. I'm curious to get your thoughts here of really just how much of an upgrade you think Kellen Moore could be from Joe Lombardi and the pass regime, and maybe highlighting how his offense might, allow Justin Herbert to take another step in 2023.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because, Lombardi gets a ton of blame for the offense. Just watching the offense last year, I mean, it's just the same plays over and over again. I'm sure, the fans know what stick routes are by now very well, and then it's just the depth of target, the type of routes that were thrown, and I think part of it was he was hamstrung by a pretty beat up offensive line too. So the health of the offensive line is going to be a major part in whether Kellen Moore can really upgrade his offense or not. But I always have been pretty impressed by what Kellen has done with the Cowboys, and I know he's not a perfect offensive coordinator. I mean, there are things that he needs to get better at too, and I think part of it, he's a very young coach. If you look at his career, he went from being an NFL quarterback to being quarterback coach, and then all of a sudden he's a coordinator. So he just really doesn't have a ton of experience coaching. But I've liked what he's done in terms of creativity, very specific game plans. But I think the biggest thing he can do for this Chargers offense is to build a dependable run game so that, it's not always all on Justin Herbert's shoulders. It'll help improve the play action game. But yeah, just getting a consistent run game that can get successful gains here down in and down out will be a big boost for this Chargers offense.
I'm curious, sorry, Tyler, to cut you off there, just kind of an expanded question here, because one thing that you talked about after the hiring was Kellen's verbiage that this merging of worlds that he's experienced in the NFL. How would you kind of define his coaching tree, or not coaching tree, I guess his coaching ancestry, if you want to call it that? Obviously, coaching for the longest tenure under Mike McCarthy. Do you think that West Coast Mike McCarthy, Sean Payton-esque offense is going to be kind of what he leans into most? Or do you think maybe his past under Jason Garrett and his playing experience might lean more into how he kind of approaches this season?
I think his latest term with Mike McCarthy will probably influence what he does the most. And, despite when Mike McCarthy kind of came out and talked about the reasons why they separated with Kellen Moore, he talked about wanting to run more, and it's kind of strange because the Cowboys were like the most run heavy team in the league last year. So I think his experience with Mike McCarthy, probably improved his ability to game plan with the run game and his willingness to run in certain situations. But I think he'll probably be more pass heavy. But it's good that he has that experience as far as building out a diverse run game. Because actually, studying the Cowboys offense, they had a really diverse run game with a ton of concepts, some really creative concepts in there as well. But I do think he'll be more pass happy with the Chargers. But the important thing is just building an efficient run game. It doesn't mean they have to run the ball every first down and just be this kind of beat your head against the wall type of team. But just getting that run game to an efficient manner will be one of the best contributions he could make as an offensive coordinator.
To your earlier point about Kellen Moore being a younger offensive coordinator, a newer offensive coordinator, what can he do to improve? I think a lot of us are focusing on, it's going to be awesome, the offense is going to be great, but there is room for improvement, I'm sure. In your eyes, where can he improve?
I think just situational football and just and maybe Charger fans don't want to hear this, but just being a little more varied, because I think sometimes he can lean into some of the things he likes a little bit, kind of like Lombardi does, to a sense. Like he also is a big fan of stick routes. Maybe Charger fans don't want to hear that, but just being a little bit more varied, having a little bit more in the fourth quarter to switch things up, I think would be a good progression for him.
Is there an opponent or a scheme where he tends to go back to maybe what's safer, what's less varied, because he wants to work with what sort of works within his wheelhouse? Because I feel like that was a common Joe Lombardi complaint among a lot of Chargers fans.
Yeah, but I think it's to a lesser degree than Lombardi. So it's just strange because, we know Mike McCarthy had an influence on what he was calling with Dallas. So it'll be curious to see what he does when he has a full reign on this offense.
Yeah, and it certainly seems like that's going to be the case. He talked about this, I believe, with Peter Schrager on his podcast, that Brandon Staley's certainly involved with the offense, but this is Kellen's offense, and he's going to be able to take charge of it and play to Justin's strengths. And one of the things that they have both kind of talked about is not necessarily like tearing this down to the studs, but like building off of what the Chargers offense has done well and adding some wrinkles in and things like that. You mentioned the Cowboys run approach. The Chargers have talked about like majoring in their strengths. What would you say from the run game perspective, what were the strengths of a Kellen Moore offense in the past few years in Dallas?
I think just the variety of runs they had. They could punish you in multiple different ways. They majored in outside zone. That was their main run, but they had so many different types of runs in their arsenal as well. They could gap scheme you. They could go inside run. They were very effective running out of the shotgun as well. And and it wasn't just because they were using Dak on options. They did that sporadically, but they were able to build a really strong shotgun run team without making the quarterback a part of the option. And I think that's going to be good to pair with Justin Herbert because, he has athleticism to run some of those option plays, but, you don't want him doing it too often. And obviously with how effective he is as a passer, you want to keep him in a shotgun as well.
Moving to the defense now, because there's so much positivity on the offensive side of the ball, and rightfully so. There's always going to be, I think, with Justin Herbert. But the other side of the ball is a bit more uncertain, and I think why a lot of fans or media members aren't buying the Chargers. But everywhere I look, it seems like all the best and respected film guys really do buy Brandon Staley as the defensive genius, elite game planner, schemer, etc. You had a great article before the wild card game that highlighted that. And in individual games, as you pointed out, I got week 2 against the Chiefs, against the 49ers, against the Dolphins, there are moments of greatness. That elite game planning is there. But in the macro of 2 seasons, the defense has underperformed relative to expectations. Granted, a lot of that is also injuries. So how does Brandon Staley take those flashes of greatness and then translate it to season-long success?
Yeah, man, that article burned me. I wrote that article, and things were looking good in the first half of the Jaguars game. They had all those picks. I was like, man, I'm looking like
vindication.
This take was a really good take, and all of a sudden the second half happened. I'm like, oh, guys are just like guys are commenting on my article as the game was happening. Like, I told you he was terrible. But man, I think in the second half of the Chargers game, and even throughout most of his Chargers tenure, he wasn't just running that Vic Fangio too high scheme that he made so good with the Rams that got him this head coaching job. He was running out too high shells, but he was playing more man coverage. He was blitzing more. His blitz percentage is a lot higher than people expect it to be when you're just looking at it. But I think really in the second half of the season last year, when the team was really banged up, he was just getting very game plan specific. And you saw that against the Miami Dolphins. You saw that against the Niners. He was willing to just not exactly scrape what he does, but he just came into that game with just a lot more ammo, a bigger menu of things, just getting very game plan specific. And I think that's a good approach for him. I think he has the right mind for it. And then, I think he is able to teach. He's a very effective teacher, and that's part of being able to run a multiple scheme is being able to get their players to execute, changing things week after week. So I think if he is able to apply that to an entire season, that defense could be very good. But again, injuries are always such a big deal. Like these guys got to stay healthy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of those guys is certainly J.C. Jackson, the Chargers corner. And you had a great article after the Chargers signed him about what Brandon Staley could do with J.C. Jackson. And one of the things you talked about was the true advantages of having like a lockdown CB1 that really never came to fruition this year. And in his absence, Michael Davis kind of emerged as that guy for them, which you talked about throughout the season. So all things kind of trending positive for J.C. Jackson. We'll see what ultimately that looks like. But what do you make of how, obviously talking about, variety of outcomes here, but this Chargers cornerback duo, and you can also talk about Asante Samuel Jr. if you want. What kind of advantages does that present for Brandon Staley heading into his third season, as Tyler alluded to previously?
Yeah, I think with J.C. Jackson, I watched some film of him right before I came on this pod just to kind of get a refresher. He just never looked like he was healthy, and he came into the season injured. It looked like he was playing really high. It looked like he had a hard time just really getting low and making breaks like he was in New England. And also there's a change of scheme, new verbiage, a lot of added responsibility. He's not just playing man coverage on every play. I mean, it's not like that's all he did in New England, but they were doing that for a majority of snaps. But yeah, I think having J.C. Jackson here for a second year, knowing the scheme, and just kind of understanding his strength and weaknesses a little better will be a huge advantage, obviously, for his second year. But having a lockdown corner in this type of scheme just allows you to have the safety help in other positions. So, they're going to be in too high, but the safety that's over on J.C. Jackson's side, he doesn't have to always play a deep half over the top of him. If you have a true lockdown corner there, you could have that safety start poaching and looking to the other side of the field, and that just opens up a lot of schemes for you. Obviously, it allows you to blitz more, which Staley wants to do when you have a guy that you can trust. You're playing too high, but having a guy that you can trust to isolate and you could disguise that in different ways is definitely an advantage. And hopefully that's what they're going to get with J.C. Jackson in year 2.
Yeah, I hope so, man. The Chargers will be better if he's healthy. I did want an outside perspective on this question because if JC comes back, my assumption is that if he can come back to full health, he's starting opposite Michael Davis, and I don't really think that would be a question, again, if he's healthy, and that's the biggest question. But then the Chargers have a bit of an issue here when it comes to the slot because, I think Asante Samuel Jr. is the better overall corner. And he certainly showed that in the first half of that game. But then the Chargers have reduced his snaps before and taken him off the field in those run obvious situations in favor of Jaw Taylor, who they drafted in the 6th round last year. So, and he had a great game in place of Bryce Callahan against the Dolphins. So in Staley's scheme, how much stress is there on that slot corner to be able to tackle and play the run? And if they don't trust Asante Samuel Jr. to play the run, and they do trust Jaw Taylor, like how much is Asante Samuel Jr. in danger of being benched? Just from like your outside perspective, what do you think they would do there?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. The nickel that Brandon Staley had with the Rams was Jalen Ramsey. And, that's it's hard to get a better run defender, with the size he has, athleticism he has at the nickel position. So that just kind of shows you how important it is to be physical at that position in this scheme. So, yeah, the corner. Aside from J.C. Jackson, they do have some smaller corners. Asante Samuel is one of them, and he could play there in passing downs, obviously. But you want a bigger nickel. And, I'm not very familiar with Jaw Taylor's game, but before the season, I thought that the fact that they did draft J.T. Woods and they did talk about this was so that they could move Derwin James down to play more nickel. And, obviously, J.T. Woods did take a little bit longer to develop. And maybe he is able to play a little bit more, but if he can play a little bit more, or they do find a different safety, and it's going to be more difficult with the Nasir Adderley, retiring as well. If you could find two good safeties you could trust to play deep, and then you could have Derwin James play in that nickel, and when he's in that nickel position, there's not a lot of guys better than him.
Yeah, I think that's something a lot of Chargers fans will be really excited about. Derwin James being around the box more, I think, is good for everybody. You mentioned JT Woods here. There are some other interesting young players on the Chargers, and we'll flip back to the offensive side here. Everybody's really excited about Quentin Johnston and his addition, and he recently talked on a different podcast about becoming the starting receiver position in this offense. There's been some mixed messaging in terms of national media, because everybody wanted the Chargers to go draft a legitimate burner and really allow Justin Herbert to have that guy who can take the top off of defenses. What do you make of Quentin's addition to this offense? Do you think he could be more of what people are looking for than maybe he's being credited for in the national media?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone wants to see that burner to take the top off of defenses, but you don't just draft a burner high up in the draft because he could get deep, because you can't find that skill. You could find that trait lower in the draft. You could find that in free agency. You could sign guys like Marquise Goodwin, who defenses have to respect his speed and stay over top of him. So you could find that skill set in other places. It doesn't have to be in the first round. So drafting Quentin Johnston, to me, it's it is a bit of a luxury pick, because you do have Mike Williams, who has a similar type of skill set. Not saying that they have the same game, but I mean, you see how much Mike Williams have gotten hurt. You see how many how these receivers were in and out of the lineup last year. So you can see why they want to have a guy like Quentin Johnston that can do multiple things, and I think he can win deep as well. But he's not just that little guy that's going to run a 4.2, but he can win deep in his own ways too. So just having him there is going to just give them depth at that position, give him a little bit more speed, because he can win deep, but again, he's not that 4.2 guy. And also just having a guy that could run after the catch. I don't think the Chargers really have a receiver that specializes in being able to create yards after the catch, and Johnson can do that.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. The Chargers have not had that for sure. Out of curiosity, just as much as you have watched with Kellen Moore and what he did in Dallas, is there any kind of role comp for what Quentin Johnston could do for the Chargers that Kellen Moore had in Dallas? They've always involved a wide receiver 3, but I don't know that they've ever had a Quentin Johnston type. But is there maybe a role comp in that offense?
I think it's difficult because CeeDee Lamb would be that guy, but they obviously have a lot of slot guys that can play in the slot with the Chargers. So maybe he can take some of those CeeDee Lamb plays as far as just getting the ball short and then trying to create after the catch.
Yeah, excellent there. Tyler, you want to get to our last question here?
No, go for it, Stephen.
Okay. Ted, again, this has been awesome, man. Thanks so much for joining us. I think everybody is trying to figure out how everybody meaning fans, obviously, trying to figure out how their respective team stacks up in the AFC, and it's a loaded group. Obviously, you have a lot of teams who have an argument to, be, reaching the mountaintop, so to speak, and potentially chasing down the Chiefs. Do you think anybody can really cash the Chiefs this year, or do you think there's going to be kind of a business as usual, so to speak, and Chiefs kind of coming out on top in the AFC this year?
I thought last year would be the year that you can catch Chiefs. I didn't think they were a bad team, but losing Tyreek Hill is a big deal, and they ended up winning the Super Bowl anyway. So I think it's possible. I mean, you see the way that the AFC West teams play the Chiefs; they play them pretty tough. Besides the Broncos, but they play them. They play them pretty tough. The Raiders, you could take them to the end of games. Obviously the game with the Chargers, were both. Games that went down to the wire. So you can beat the Chiefs, but with Patrick Mahomes there, Andy Reid, it's a very tough ordeal. But it's possible, but it is tough.
Yeah, that's definitely the right choice there. Ted, this has been great, man. Chargers fans, make sure and go check his articles out on The Athletic. Obviously, you guys know Daniel Popper very well. Ted is another great contributor over there, recently doing a fantastic article on Mr. Max Crosby. So if you want some Raiders intel, go check that out and see what's in store for this season. So Ted, thanks so much for joining, man. Appreciate your time today. We'll be in touch down the road for sure.
No problem. Thanks for having me on, guys.
All right, Tyler, what did you think of, man? That was a great conversation. What was kind of your big takeaway from that conversation with Mr. Ted Nguyen?
Just the hope that this defense can get that consistency that we've been looking for, because he talked about it and we've talked about it and we've seen it. Like, this defense is so talented and this coach is very, very smart. Just things haven't been able to come together, game to game to game to game for an entire season. So just getting closer to that, feeling like we can work in JC Jackson. I think Ted pointing out that JC came back from that injury, and he came back very early and didn't look the same, I think is, I guess, a good sign, although this injury that he sustained after he came back is really brutal. But the fact that we definitely weren't getting the JC Jackson that we saw in New England, mainly or completely because he just was not healthy, I guess kind of is a good thing and something optimistic, because this whole offseason, if he can come back healthy and be healthy week 1 or week 5 or whenever he joins the team, the Chargers could be really, really good on defense. And I hope they're really, really good this year, man.
Yeah, that's the hype and hope for the offense has kind of been there, obviously, since Kellen Moore got hired. Mm-hmm. But it's been a pretty pessimistic offseason for the defense, and so I think maybe some of that's starting to build back up a little bit. Hopefully, talking to Ted and that interview helped you guys gain some optimism as well. I think for me, and this is something that I've kind of gone back and forth with just watching the Cowboys offense is, I think the real strength of Kellen Moore and Brandon Staley, I think we can see them aligning pretty frequently, and that's their ability to come in and take a game plan and really adapt it to whoever they are playing against. And that's not really something we saw much of. It was generally a lot of like, we're going to do what we do on offense, and that's just going to work, and we're going to have Justin Herbert, be Justin Herbert, and we're going to score points. If you watch the Cowboys offense on a week-to-week basis, the last 4 seasons under Kellen Moore, they might head into one game and they're going to air it out, and Dak's going to throw it 55, 60 times. The next week, you see Zeke at 25 carries, Tony Pollard 15, and they're just going to go run heavy. And I watched that from the 2019 season. I watched them play against the Packers, and Zeke barely had any touches, and it was all Dak, and it was all, airing it out, and it was a lot of fun to watch. It was. And then you watch them a couple weeks later against the Giants, and it was like every other play was, we're just going to run at you, and you can't stop us. So the ability that Kellen Moore has to specifically game plan, I think, is something that Chargers fans will be really happy about, and Ted pointed that out a little bit as well.
Yeah, I love hearing that. I'm glad you're going back to watch the film, whether it's offense or defense. Maybe one of these undrafted free agents can help out.
Yeah, definitely. All right, good transition there, by the way. Well done. All right, so we have, I'm not going to lie, I haven't watched film on all of these undrafted free agents. I've gotten to 9 of them. So there's some that I think are just have an extra long shot just based off of the positions that they play. But we're going to highlight 5 undrafted free agents that we feel have a legitimate chance to make this roster. And this is not necessarily like a power ranking. Like, we're not going to sit here and say like so-and-so is better than so-and-so. But this is, talking about players who have a legitimate chance to make this roster. There's definitely some debate, I think, here, some good players who can fit into some roles that, sometimes there's some surprises. Like, I don't think anybody really had Roderick Teamer making the Chargers roster, but, sometimes you just have a role and that role fits into a position of need. So, Tyler, who do you think of this undrafted free agent class has the best chance of making this roster?
The best chance would be Gerard Clark from Coastal Carolina. He's a big guy. Everyone knows that. Chargers fans are very excited about him. And just going through granted, this is national media, but the way that he was scouted and the draft grades put on him, you look at the Bleacher Report, they had a 5th round grade. Damian Parson, our guy at the Draft Network, I believe had a 3rd round grade on him. Zerline from NFL.com had a 5th round grade on him. So, not saying that this is a 1st round player that fell to the Chargers as an undrafted free agent, but a draftable player, and at least early on day 3, and they got him as an undrafted free agent. And I think more than anything else, whether I think he's better than some of these other undrafted free agents at his position, that's a debate. But you're talking about who is maybe more likely to make the team. It really comes down to the position that he plays and the openings that could be there, because there's no other spot on this team where you can project potentially 2 openings in front of this player. Now, granted, that doesn't mean that he's the next in line. It could be Hinton, it could be Terrence Lang, it could be anybody else. But there are potentially going to be 2 openings to start the season, not by the end of the year, but with Austin Johnson being hurt, his health up in the air, Otito Ogboni, I think we know even less about him and his injury. I think Gerard Clark, with what he can do, what he can bring, his draft pedigree, his background, and the fact that there's 2 openings in front of him, I think he's most likely to make the roster. And even just the last 2 seasons, right? The Chargers are very fluid with their defensive tackle spot to start the season. They like to, if one guy balls out in the preseason, they like to have that player make the initial roster. And then once, all the cuts happen and the waiver period goes through, then maybe they cut that player and they go to the practice squad. So in 2021, it was Forrest Merrill. In 2022, it was Braden Fajoko. So if Gerard Clark balls out in the preseason and in training camp, I could see them doing the same thing. So to me, Gerard Clark, again, whether I think he's better or worse or whatever than their players is a whole different thing. But he has the easiest opportunity and chance to make the roster, I think.
Yeah, and I think his skill set obviously does lend itself towards filling a position of need for the Chargers, depending on health, like you mentioned. I think statistically you can point out, Gerard Clark had 16 run stops in 2021. He had 19 this past year in 2022. And the good thing there is that his run stop percentage actually increased by almost 3 whole points from 2022 to 2021 to 2022. His 8.0% run stop percentage was 12th best in the country last year of players who were draft eligible in 2023. So he was right next to Gervon Dexter, who I know you liked in this draft. For what it's worth, Scott Matlock, who the Chargers did draft, although different skill sets, he was at 6.7, but he did have 24 total run stops. So you look at the guys on this list who were maybe drafted ahead of him. Siaki Ika was at 6.6%. Byron Young from Alabama, 6.5%. So it just kind of shows you the kind of player that he can be, for a potential defense. And you're looking at a 3-4 scheme that is a little bit more versatile up front than I think people are, usually thinking. Like, I think the days of like a true stereotypical nose tackle are kind of done with. Like, there really aren't that many guys out there, but that's what Gerard Clark can be. He can eat up space at the nose. And I think the nice thing there is that can free up Sebastian Joseph Day and Austin Johnson and whoever else is healthy to really focus in on playing the 3-tech role, the 5-tech role. And we saw with Braden Fajoko's emergence down the stretch last year that that freedom for Sebastian Joseph Day really allowed him to kind of get back to his former self too.
Yeah. Do you have him ahead of I know you're not talking about like ahead of behind, but like Terrence Lang is the other guy that could make it. And we're talking about 2 injuries. But do you have Gerard Clark ahead of Terrence Lang because the difference in them is like 50 pounds? 2 completely different kinds of players, different roles on the team.
Yeah, so Terrence Lang from Colorado, for those who don't know, he kind of played in like the 3-3-5 defense that's super prevalent in college football. So he was a quote-unquote edge rusher for Colorado, but the Chargers do have him listed as a defensive lineman. I think he's more pigeonholed into playing an inside defensive end, kind of a similar role as like Morgan Fox, who can occasionally kick outside. Terrence Lang, I think for me, I would have graded Terrence Lang higher than I would have graded Gerard Clark personally. I think Terrence Lang just gives you a bit more speed presence. I think it gives you a bit more polish in the hand usage, because Gerard Clark, I think he's a space eater, but I think he can improve with his hands. I think he can improve with his pad level too. Terrence Lang was a 6-year player in college, was a very common theme in the draft this year. So Terrence Lang, I think, has a bit more polish to him. And so I think there can be a role for Terrence Lang. I think he's kind of, I would have him behind Chris Hinton in terms of like jockeying for a position there. But I think there is a role for Terrence Lang because he's an inside defensive end who his strength is defending the run. So we're talking about a lot of run defense guys today. But you look at his statistics this past year in college at Colorado, he was 14th in run stop percentage at 8.7%, among edge rushers. So it's a little different kind of projecting there. But, a lot of guys who were drafted much earlier than him who were touted as like run defense guys, Keon White was at 7.1%. Isaiah Foskey was from Notre Dame was at 6.7%. So this is a real strength of Terrence Lang's, and I don't think there's a ton of projection in that regard for him to carve out a potential role on early downs. Pass rushing is a bit of a work in progress. He does have, kind of a speed to power package to him, but there's not a whole lot of countering off of that. But great length, great first step, and then he's just kind of a bull in a china shop as a run defender too. So I like Lang more, but I think he's kind of down the pecking order than Gerard Clark would be, because Gerard Clark plays a role that the Chargers don't really have a lot of options behind Austin Johnson and Otito Ogbonnia.
Yep, I agree with you there, and I can't wait to see this guy play. He's got 34.75-inch arms, which is a little bit longer than Sebastian Joseph Day's arms. And the Chargers and Brandon Staley, Jade Rogers, these guys all really do covet that length. So hopefully it pays off.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I would put Terrence Lang in my top 5 of likely to make it. I would have him at 5, though. I agree. I think Gerard Clark is the most likely to make it. Second for me, I was really surprised by this guy when I watched his tape earlier this week, and that's AJ Finley from Ole Miss. We know the Chargers have a need at safety. Sounds like you like him too. And I think me and you are higher on Raheem Lane than general consensus among Chargers fans, but I think AJ Finley can just give them a little bit something different that they don't really have. I think you have obviously Derwin, who can do everything. I think Alohi's kind of your box safety run defender guy. I think JT in an ideal world can be kind of your center fielder. But I was really impressed with AJ Finley when he would match up one-on-one, when he would match coverages. I thought his instincts in that regard were fantastic. And I think that was kind of something we liked about Mark Webb initially when he had, his great first training camp as a rookie. You haven't seen it come to fruition in the regular season yet, but AJ Finley as a pass defender, I think, has a really, really high IQ. That's something we know that Brandon Staley really values in this defense. Ronaldo Hill's talked about it. Derek Ansley has talked about it. The ability to see things happening in front of them. I think there are some limits athletically with him. He's not like the quickest to break on the ball, but just in terms of like positioning, matching routes, making plays on the football, I thought AJ Finley was outstanding in those regards. So he would be second behind Gerard Clark for me.
Yeah, he made my top 5. Just watched him earlier this week. And you took everything that I possibly could have said about him. And it really does come down to, we're talking about roster projections here. Is there an opportunity for him? And while I think that the safety room is sort of crowded, there's that last spot that really isn't. Like, I do think Raheem Lane is the front runner, then Mark Webb, then Finley, but I don't think any of those two guys in front of him are so irreplaceable. Again, I think Raheem Lane makes the roster, but watching AJ Finley, you know, with his production at Ole Miss, what he's able to do, what he shows in coverage, like you talked about, there were moments where I'm like, are you sure he's not going to be a corner? Like, I almost thought that he could just convert to corner rather than be a safety and do really well there. So I think that there's an uphill battle, of course. I think because Raheem Lane was a corner, he can cover. Mark Webb, we've seen, he can cover. So there is definitely an uphill battle there. But AJ Finley's really, really talented. He made my top 5 as well.
Yeah, I was surprised with, you know, how much I liked an Ole Miss safety. It's not usually their forte. Although obviously the Chargers are pretty familiar with him and his game because they drafted Dean Leonard last year. So, you know, I'm sure that they watched a lot of AJ Finley too. So I think he's a willing run defender. I don't think it's necessarily his strong suit. So that's kind of like, I think the area that he really needs to focus in on if he's going to make this team. Special teams is going to play a huge role there. So, you know, that's kind of like the leg up that I think Raheem Lane has over the other guys. But, you know, like you said, it's not enough of an advantage for him that he's like the clear cut safety 4, although I mean, you're probably higher on him than most. All right, Tyler, who would be next on the list for you?
So we've talked about him before, but that's Mike Gesicki, the tight end from UCLA. Again, opportunity. Daniel Popper had the Chargers carrying 4 tight ends this year. Whether that happens or not, I don't know. But the Chargers certainly could use more development at tight end, get someone in the room to continue to develop. But he had Stone Smart making it. And for right now, yes, I do think Stone Smart is ahead of Mike Gesicki. I think anyone who was on the team is ahead of most undrafted free agents. But I think Gesicki, what he did or what he can do as a converted, you know, wide receiver to tight end, as he continues to grow, and like literally because he's bulking up to play tight end, get bigger, get stronger, etc. As he learns more of the ins and outs of that, I do think that he can start pushing for that tight end 4 spot. I think they have to keep 4 tight ends for him to make it, but I do think he can push for that spot because I think Stone Smart is right now the better receiver, another converted player from quarterback. So I do think he's the better receiving option right now, but Gesicki is very good in that regard as well. And if he can hold it as a blocker, that's going to be huge. We're talking about all these guys need to contribute on special teams. And I think if Gesicki can show that he's the better blocker, and also that's the Chargers just need that on offense anyway, I think he has a nice shot to make the roster.
Yeah, I do too. I think the offense is really going to focus in on yards after catch when it comes to this tight end room, maybe outside of Gerald Everett, and I think that is a strong suit of Mikey Gesicki. So I think even Jason Witten in 2019, I was watching Cowboys 2019 offense, and Jason Witten was getting yards after catch opportunities left and right. And I was like, okay, I don't know if I'd be doing that personally, but you know, it is what it is. So I think Gesicki can come in and fit that role. I think if you look at his numbers, like his efficiency on a per touch basis was really outstanding. He averaged 6.6 yards after catch per reception, which was 9th of any draft eligible tight end this past season. He was ahead of Sam Laporta. He was ahead of Dalton Kincaid. He was ahead of Luke Schoonmaker, Josh Wiley, all guys who were drafted. You look at his yards per route run, though, that's kind of a UCLA thing because he wasn't targeted a whole lot. But his average depth of target was 8.5. So he's somebody who can, you know, work the middle of the field. He can stretch defenses vertically. He can give you yards after catch in space. So I think he's an intriguing prospect for me. The tight end room, like you mentioned, I think they would have to keep 4. You know, they might sign somebody else. So I was a little hesitant to put Gesicki in my top 5. So for me, he was just outside of it, but definitely worth talking about because I do think that he could come in and fill a role and give them another target who can provide some intriguing athletic traits.
Who else is on your list?
So I think there is a world in which one of these receivers makes this team. And I think this has to be Pokey Wilson, not Williams. Got it right that time. So I think Pokey Wilson can give them some things that that the other guys behind him don't necessarily have. I think you look at body types. I think Pokey Wilson and Terrell Bynum are kind of similar body types, but the skill sets are very different. I think Pokey Wilson can give you some more versatility. I actually really liked what he was able to do with the ball in his hands. Again, potential yards after catch in this offense, I think, is crucial. The stuff that we've seen from OTAs and stuff like that has mostly been him as an outside receiver, but I do think his best work comes as a slot option for me. I don't know if you feel that way, but I think his speed is not necessarily, high end. I think he's more quick than fast, but I think he can give them some flexibility with the slot. And I think he can give them some versatility in terms of like being a jet sweep guy. I think he can be, a jump ball guy in the red zone if he wants to. So I think Pokey Wilson is just kind of the most well-rounded receiver of these undrafted guys, and I do think that he would be number 3 on my list for me.
Yeah, he's actually number 3 on my list as well. So there you go. And I do agree that he is more quick than fast, and like he literally is more quick than fast. His 40 time, granted, that's not everything. We've talked about GPS tracking data with Tom Telesco, but he does run a 4.6, so he's not like a burner on the team. And that's why he's 3rd right now. I could see him being 1st or even 2nd if he were a bit faster, or if the Chargers didn't have someone like Hightower in front of him. So, it's a crowded room for sure. And I think there's a lot of guys who can do a lot of great things for this receiving core room. He just unfortunately lands on a team this year that has their most well-rounded receiving core room in the past decade, I think.
Yeah, we'll see what happens here. Obviously, I think if Jalen Guyton's healthy, then I think Pokey Wilson, moves down my list. But we just don't know. We haven't really seen or heard much of an update about Jalen Guyton recently, and so until we know there, I think one of these receivers does have to at least be mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'll go with one more name before we get out of here, and that is Tyler Huseman, the running back from North Dakota. I think he might follow in the tradition of, Brandon Oliver, Detrez Newsome, Kenneth Farrow, Austin Ekeler, all these running backs who is undrafted free agent guys who make the roster. And I think that, well, first of all, Tyler Huseman has an elite first name. No bias there. He just has a really good first name. But if you compare actual football stuff, if you compare relative athletic scores, he would be the 2nd most athletic running back behind Austin Ekeler and ahead of Joshua Kelly. Not by much. But the Chargers room isn't like the most dynamic athletically, so him being the 2nd most athletic by that score would help. He definitely broke out after transferring to North Dakota from Northern Iowa. He averaged 5.8 yards per carry, over 1,000 yards, 12 touchdowns on just 175 attempts. What I do really like, and what I think helps translate to special teams, is that he blocks really well. He blocks with aggressiveness. He runs hard in the red zone. There were no fumbles last year, no drops. So I really think in that regard, catching Ryan Ficken's eye, he's competing with Larry Roundtree for that 4th spot. Now, is there going to be a 4th spot? I don't know. But obviously they did carry 4 last year. They did have Larry Roundtree on the team. So I do think someone like Huseman, who is a bit bigger than Dotson, can kind of have that role potentially. Again, I'm not really sure how much of a space there is for a 4th running back. But if Xander Horvath is not a big part of Kellen Moore's plans, then I could see Huseman starting as one of those wings on kickoff opposite Joshua Kelly. Ryan Ficken tries to have more of those running back, fullback types, whereas we saw with Swinton, it was Chris Rumpf out there and some other player I can't remember. So if they want to go that route, he could definitely make it that way. And I talked to Huseman earlier today, and he's sharing about his journey from Northern Iowa to North Dakota. He wanted to get somewhere where he wasn't in that running back by committee, so he could really show off what he could do as a lead back, gain that confidence, develop those skills, that sort of thing. And he really did get to showcase that, even though he wasn't like a 300 carry back like I'm sure Bijan was. It's still 175 carries. I think 22 out of 23 targets were caught for him. So obviously he made the Chargers, so things worked out for him. But he's got a lot to learn, a lot to develop. This is a player who hasn't had a ton of action, but he's certainly working on that, I guess, with running backs coach Derek Foster. He's working on pre-snap and post-snap, defensive recognition because, all these guys are bigger, faster, stronger. They've played in the league for several years or they're just super talented. So he's working on that. He's working on explosiveness out of his cuts, working on getting faster, which is great. I'd love a very fast running back on this team if we can get one. But he's really looking forward to bringing his downhill running style to the team, which is something that could complement Austin Ekeler. So I think there's a world where maybe the Chargers don't have 4 right away, but he could work onto the roster because of special teams and because the Chargers do need to prepare for the vacuum and the empty space that will occur when guys like Austin Ekeler, when guys like Joshua Kelly, projecting for now, who knows? But the contracts are up, right? So at some point, they're going to need to find some other guys to work in here. I'm not saying that he's going to start for Austin Ekeler next season, but I do think he's someone that could catch Ryan Ficken's eye and work his way onto the roster either early on or at some point during the season.
Yeah, I would love to see that because I think Joshua Kelly, I think he's a good special teamer, but I want him focusing on offense. I think there is a need for somebody to emerge and take that off of his plate. Maybe that's Isaiah Spiller this year. We don't know, but I think Joshua Kelly is going to be super important on offense, and they're going to need somebody to take some off of his special teams plate. So I would love to see that. Just quickly, I think Tywone Mullen is worth mentioning. The former cornerback from Indiana, pretty similar profile to Ja'Sir Taylor in terms of his size, speed, slot flexibility. One of my favorite things about him is actually his work as a blitzer. I think that's a fantastic role for him and maybe a way for him to distinguish himself. So wanted to at least mention him briefly. I think he could be maybe a little redundant with all of the things that need to happen at slot, because I think that's where he's probably best projected in the NFL. But maybe there's a world where Ja'Sir Taylor is a starter and less of a special teams player. Maybe Tywone Mullen can kind of take that over from him. So I think Tywone Mullen is worth mentioning. Didn't know this earlier, but the younger brother of Trayvon Mullen, formerly of the Las Vegas Raiders. So NFL bloodlines, I guess, there.
I guess I could have made that connection. Sometimes it's like, oh yeah, duh. How did I not put that together?
Yeah.
So awesome. Yeah. The DB room is so tough to crack, particularly if you're looking at corner. Like, where do these guys fit in? But I guess like if maybe JC's not healthy, then maybe there's a spot. But is that Keemon Hall? It's kind of tough to break into that one.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Great conversations today with Ted Nguyen. Great undrafted free agent conversation. Hopefully you guys are getting excited for training camp. Obviously, that's kind of the goal of these episodes. It's kind of ramp up that excitement as we get closer and closer to football. So appreciate everybody for tuning in. Special thanks again to Ted for joining us. Thanks to Greg Kim for producing the show today. Make sure to subscribe to the channel here and our own, the Guilty as Charged podcast. Really have some other content throughout the rest of the lead up towards training camp. So Tyler, appreciate you as well. That's going to do it for us today. We'll see you guys next time. And as always, Bolt up.